morning to you all. My name is Pamela Abner, and I'm from Mount Sinai Health System in New York, where I serve as Vice President and Chief Diversity Operations Officer. Welcome to what will be an enlightening discussion on the vital topic of incorporating equity into climate change strategies. Today, we have two exceptional experts who will share their insights and experiences on this crucial intersection of climate change and social justice. As you know, climate change poses one of the greatest challenges of our time, affecting every corner of the globe and threatening the very foundation of our ecosystems and societies. It's no longer a distant problem, but an urgent reality that demands immediate action. However, it's important to recognize that the impacts of climate change are not distributed equally. Vulnerable communities, marginalized populations, and those with limited resources bear the brunt of its consequences, exacerbating existing inequalities and injustices. Incorporating equity into climate change strategies is not only a moral imperative, but also an essential step towards building a more resilient and just future. It requires us to address the disproportionate burdens faced by marginalized groups, ensure their meaningful participation in decision-making, and provide fair access to resources, opportunities, and benefits of climate action. I hope the discussion today will inspire and empower all of us to create transformative and inclusive solutions that leave no one behind. Together, let us build a future that is not only resistant and sustainable, but also fair and just for all. So please join me in welcoming Dan Chu and Marta Segura. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. I think it lays the ground well. I'm Justin Worland. I'm a senior correspondent at Time, where I write about climate change. Thrilled to be here with Dan Chu, the executive director of the Sierra Club Foundation, and Marta Segura, the chief heat officer of the city of Los Angeles. In nearly a decade on the climate beat, one thing I've noticed is that equity in the context of climate can mean something very different to different people. On the Gulf Coast, it might mean access to clean air away from petrochemical pipelines. In India, it might mean demands from the global north to provide finance to have a clean energy transition. So I figured one place to start would be to ask each of you to talk about what climate equity means to you and what it means in the context of your work. So we can start with you, Marta.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. For me, it's both personal and professional. I grew up in San Jose, and our entire neighborhood was demolished to put a highway. Then when we were moved, we were sprayed by malathion by crop dusters. So that moment changed me, and I realized that we needed to engage people in decision-making, empower them to be part of the decision-making process. So at the City of LA, what equity or climate equity means to me is the end result is healthy, thriving communities, but we partner with frontline communities, the historically disinvested, those that have been the sacrifice zones of every city, because that's where the pollution is, that's where the worst housing is, and that's where the chronic illnesses are greater. So I believe that if we invest first and foremost in those communities, we actually resolve the climate problem for everyone in the entire region, because that's where the greatest problems are. And yesterday we had to talk about data. I'll talk about that a little later, but it's going to be really important to align climate, health, and equity data at the city level, where we are uniquely adapted to create this kind of transformation. So those are some of the things that equity means to me, and I can further elaborate later about the engagement portion of it. Yeah.
Great, great. Dan?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I'm Dan. First, just want to send Ben Jealous his regrets that he couldn't make it today, and he asked me to sit in. So at the Sierra Club and Sierra Club Foundation, we're sister organizations, and we have about 2 million members and supporters across the country. as well as 64 chapters in every state and about 12 in California. So we really think about, at the end of the day, that we're there to support and hopefully create a greater impact from people at the local and community level. So for us, we've been on a journey, an equity journey, where equity is, in my mind, a word that says everybody should have equal access to clean air, clean water, quality jobs, and healthy communities, as well as access to public natural spaces. But we're thinking beyond that now, that equity at the end of the day also means collective justice. And so have had a lot of deep conversations about that. And to Marta's point, justice ultimately for us is about having real self-determination for communities to determine their future rather than their future being determined for them. And so that comes down to how do we create that collective long-term power for frontline communities, indigenous communities, and also how can they help us out of this collective crisis we're in? Because they have the solutions often. Indigenous communities have been on that land for thousands of years, and they've not only survived but thrived. How do they help us out of this extractive, colonizing frame that has got us to where we are today?
Well, that's a good segue. I want to talk later. We'll get to the questions about what you're doing, the work that you're doing to actually address these. But I want to take a minute just to talk about the root of these challenges, and Dan, you were alluding to that. So just I'll ask very broadly. What are the sort of systemic, structural issues that have led to this climate inequity, these disparities that we see? And Dan, we'll start with you, and we'll come to Marta.
Sure. Well, there's a couple of different frames. I guess I'll just start that at the core of the climate crisis is the fact that we've burned oil, gas, and coal for the last 170 years. We've now consumed over 2,000 gigatons of carbon that's been emitted into the atmosphere. And the scary thing is there's 2,000 gigatons of oil, gas, and coal that have been identified as proven reserves that are in the ground that can still be burned. So for us, at the very core of this injustice is this whole economic system built on a one-way extractive economy. Basically, not understanding that the earth is a closed system and that we need a closed-loop economy that has put us in this situation where we're at today.
Marta, and I'd be especially curious to hear your thoughts on the broad question, but also in Los Angeles in particular, to get a sense of the problems there and what the origins are.
Yeah. So if you look at a map of LA, and I think any major city that has had factories, oil drilling, refineries, you'll see that there's a correlation between where the low-income folks live, which is in those pollution-burdened areas, and that is an entire history, not just of disinvestment, but of really poor top-down leadership, decision-making, leaders making decisions for these communities, displacing them, demolishing their neighborhoods, and putting something else extractive in there to replace it that also surrounds other low-income communities that over time are the chronically ill of our cities. So when any disaster comes along, whether it's extreme heat or something like Katrina, those are the communities that suffer the greatest. That's why yesterday I was talking about when we say the word equity or climate equity, we have to mean it. And how do we do that? We have to really monitor and track climate health and equity data together and get that baseline and make sure that in the long run, as we make these huge climate investments that are coming from the federal government, that we are directing the majority, if not all of those investments, to the historically disinvested communities where we want to see the greatest change. So we have to be accountable by having the right tools in place, the right platforms in place, making them democratic tools so everybody could see what investments are being made, how it's changing chronic illness, how it's reducing ER visits in those areas. So accountability for me, and not having a top-down system where only the elected leaders make decisions, is really important. So in LA, we have a commission that's representative of those frontline communities. All of our programs, reports, events for my office are co-designed with frontline and community leaders to make sure that they are in these panels. They are part of the leadership that's directing change towards the city government. So it's really something that we have to do in partnership with. They're not my constituents, they're my partners, right? They're somebody that makes decisions with us, and that's how city leaders have to begin responding. And with that kind of transformative data that includes healthy, thriving communities as the outcome and the end goal, then I think we can see some change. Just measuring carbon is not going to get us there. Putting as many tools as you want, or technologies as you want to reduce carbon is not going to get us there, because we still have air quality issues. We still have those long-term air pollution issues. And these disinvestments and these historically redline communities will continue to be chronically ill. We should have, from the very beginning of this climate crisis, focus in on the health outcomes of communities. Then, by now, we would have already been delivering some of the changes we wanted to see.
So you're talking about putting not just data about emissions, but data about health as part of the metrics of how you assess what's happening, right? So I'd be curious to hear a little bit. When we were talking earlier, you said every department is a climate equity department, and you talked about the role of data in that and the equity index. Maybe you could explain to everyone what the equity index does and how that rollout is going.
Sure. So in the city of Los Angeles, we've created an equity index, which includes climate, health, housing, you name it. Social determinants of health are all included in this equity index. Of course, we can improve it with improved climate equity metrics like the UCLA heat risk map, but the purpose of that equity index is so that all the general managers who are responsible for implementing these investments, these millions of dollars that are going to the city of Los Angeles, they can then measure those investments against, are these going to these historically disinvested communities that are pollution burdened? And then we can be able to track that and demonstrate that to our partners, our communities, elected leaders, and the media. I think it's really important to have the media as a partner too, because they shine the light on the things that don't go well, but they also help shine the light on things that are working. So that's the democratization of data that I think cities have been missing. You can report GHG emissions all you want, but it's not going to tell me anything about how has that improved these communities. Has that made them more sustainable? Has it made them more livable? Has it reduced chronic illness or emergency room visits? And that's what we want to know.
Yeah, it's such a data collection, and being able to map is such an important conversation at this intersection. Dan, I'd love to come to you and anything you want to add there, but I especially want to ask, Marta was talking about partnership with communities, and I know this is something that the Sierra Club works on. How do you work with frontline communities? How do you make sure that they're involved in the programming and the decisions that you make? So I would love to hear your thoughts, your sort of learnings, best practices about how to actually do that, how to partner with communities.
Great. Yeah, the other data point I'd like to add is, for instance, there's a terminology called energy burden, and it's kind of economic energy burden. So, for instance, in Wisconsin, our chapter teamed up with a bunch of local groups and did an analysis in Milwaukee and showed that the percentage of net income communities of color pay for energy is much higher than wealthy suburban communities. Some of that actually came down to kilowatt hour costs were more per kilowatt hour because the utilities said those communities were greater risk of default. So a lot of inequity there, and and to Marta's point, that kind of economic disparity does result in public health implications as well. And then, yeah, I'd love to just share a few examples. I hope will give you a little insight into how we're approaching the work in a way that is consistent with our values around justice and anti-racism and self-determination. So one example is back in 2017, the Trump tax bill put in there a provision that said some of the revenue would be recouped from drilling the Arctic refuge. And it's home over the last 5,000 years for the Gwich'in, who depend on the caribou. And essentially, it was a plan for genocide. This community would die. And we knew that we couldn't stop the permitting process in that hostile administration, but we slowed it down, gummed it up in the courts and with our allies on the Hill. But at the end of the day, our theory of change was we have to stop financing of the oil and gas. So we brought together a letter that had about $2.5 trillion of assets under management signed onto that letter. We sent it to every single bank in the world, as well as every oil and gas company, articulating that there were significant human rights violations that would result in reputational risk and financial risk for those companies. And over the next 3 or 4 years, we brought those indigenous leaders into boardrooms and into meetings with the C-suites of every major bank. And near the end of the Trump administration, every bank actually changed their internal policies to say they would not drill in the Arctic. And when the oil leases came out from the administration, the only entity that bid on those oil leases was the state of Alaska. No oil companies bid on it because we made it reputationally at risk. And my point there is that, you know, for us it was about wildlife, it was about climate impacts, but for the Gwich'in it was about their very survival. And for the banks, what was really compelling was that human rights piece, because they had policies around human rights and free and prior informed consent. And it was a great learning for us to say, you know, even though we care deeply about climate and we care about our partnerships, this frame around human rights and genocide, we weren't credible on that. It really had to be the tribal leadership. So that's one example I want to share. And since then, we continue to do a lot of work on shareholder resolutions and that kind of thing with all the major banks to get them to have a transition plan to no longer finance fossil fuel projects.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. You know, that conversation really reminds me of what I named earlier, which is sacrifice zones, because since we have historically polluted these areas, we don't treat them as genocide. We don't treat them as human rights violations. We don't treat them as an emergency or even a climate emergency. Not historically, because that's where the refineries exist, or that's where the big donors exist, the big corporations exist. And so we really have to flip the switch, and I think view those environmental justice communities as communities that are in emergency zones, sacrifice zones, health crisis zones, so that we can elevate the conversation if the corporations really care about this, you know, value, about the very communities in the United States that are suffering the greatest harm. So that just kind of inspired me to say something like that. But in terms of community involvement, community engagement, EJ, environmental justice communities, have been fighting for change for over 30 years now. And the Biden administration is the first administration to fully recognize that with Justice 40, and by ensuring that most of the departments are creating environmental justice grant making so that these communities are directly addressed. And Justice 40 is basically saying we want every city in the nation to prioritize investing in these historically disinvested communities. So we would not have had Justice 40 without that environmental justice movement over the last 30 years. And I used to work as a statewide program director for Communities for a Better Environment in Los Angeles. And I think all my life I've been an environmental justice advocate before I was in this role, right? So it's really important that we all take a part in what we believe in, what we're passionate about, and grow that involvement and grow that engagement. And that's why we have campaigns at the city now that will engage individuals to ensure not just that they play their part, but they can become part of this larger transformation that I think we're going to be making. I don't think the city is, I'm the inaugural chief heat officer, the inaugural director of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office. And at the same time, I come from these sacrifice zones. I'm an environmental justice advocate first and foremost. The City of LA has never had that, and I want to see that for every city. I want every city to have representation that really truly believes in the commitment of partnerships with these frontline communities, but with everyone as a whole, because I guess what I'm trying to say is we'll accelerate climate solutions if we invest first and foremost in these communities, and everyone will benefit. And that's the piece that's been missing from our strategies.
Well, I want to pick up on that point, and just to ask. I mean, you're talking about well, you said, you know, you need these voices in climate solutions. Of course, talking about community solutions and the role of environmental justice and you know, what's happening in these communities. But what about on the macro level? What is the interaction between environmental justice and mitigation, and how can these two solutions work hand in hand? So I'd be curious to hear from you, Marta, and Dan. I know Sierra Club Beyond Coal campaign, I think, is a great example of that, but I'd be curious to hear from both of you on that question.
Well, I think Justice 40 is a great example of mitigation coming from an environmental justice movement, because that really means those are infrastructure dollars. Those are mitigation dollars. Those are dollars to repair these communities. And I think that would not have happened had these communities not been involved, not just in LA, but nationwide, right? I think the Deep South also has a very strong environmental justice movement, Dr. Bullard being the father of environmental justice. But I also view Cesar Chavez as a forefather of environmental justice, because he was the first in California to have a campaign around pesticides that involved consumers against the growers, right? And he involved people way beyond the people that he was organizing, and made very great legislative change with that level of organizing.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that and say the Inflation Reduction Act that passed late last year was the largest investment in climate and clean energy solutions, and that's what Marta's talking about as it relates to how that Justice 40 now applies to about $300 billion that's coming out through IRA, but also before that, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, which is a $1.2 trillion bill that passed. About $300 billion of that actually also goes towards climate solutions, public transit and infrastructure around that. So for us, the challenge and the opportunity is through all of our grassroots, our chapters, our community partners, to make sure as that money flows to the states and localities, it actually goes towards real solutions that benefit public health for underserved communities, that builds collective long-term power for those communities so that they have that self-determination, and don't get hijacked, where those dollars don't end up creating, new paving projects for highways. Some of those dollars I know are earmarked for repairing Latino and Black communities that were split in half by a highway, just like you were talking about earlier in your life. Let's make sure that actually creates opportunities to pull those communities together versus going towards some other pet project that has nothing to do and may actually make climate worse. So it's an enormous opportunity. It's also, I think, an enormous challenge for us in the next number of months.
Well, can I follow up and ask, how is it going from your perspective? I mean, it's early days for the Inflation Reduction Act, but the bipartisan infrastructure law is older. Do you see that that the principles in Justice 40 are actually being followed through? I mean, Justice 40 is an executive order. It's not necessarily something that has the weight of something that's law. And then two, for people here and people who might listen or watch this session, what's the best way to engage in ensuring that money is well spent and that it advances equity?
Yeah, so that's a great question. At the highest level, the EPA just established their first environmental justice kind of sector within the EPA to really have much more coordination around implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. For instance, within it, there's something called the Greenhouse Gas Fund that would provide block grants to community groups to do clean energy and things like building efficiency, building electrification, public transit, electric buses, charging stations, all that kind of stuff. So we're cautiously optimistic that it's now finally getting through the gears of the federal government regulations and starting to go out there. Second thing I'd say is we've partnered with Al Gore's Climate Reality Project, and they just did a series of trainings, free trainings on how to engage with IRA and Infrastructure and Jobs Act at the local level. So encourage you all, if you want to go look at the Climate Reality Project website. I know that there's future trainings coming up. Some of them are for administrators like Marta, others are for kind of local activists, and others are for investors, because the Inflation Reduction Act, actually the largest chunk of that $300 billion is actually tax credits to encourage private investors to leverage those $300 billion with 2 or 3 or 5x of private dollars to really make things happen, particularly in underserved communities that many investors in the past have saw as higher risk
Yeah.
for investments. So a big chunk of that is tax credits, and then some of them are direct grants, as Marta was talking about.
Yeah, in Los Angeles, I think I've seen an interesting pattern emerge where local philanthropy is collaborating with state philanthropy, and we're trying to take advantage of these EPA technical assistance and capacity building grants because they're trying to do this nationwide, right? Fund technical assistance to communities everywhere so that they have the capacity to apply for these bigger dollars. They know that there's a gap. They know that there's a void. They know that they need to build capacity. So in some ways, I kind of feel like we're building the plane and flying it at the same time. And it really is the first time this has ever been done. So I anticipate it's not going to be perfect. But the good thing is, you know, in LA, I think we have a local philanthropy really with their ears on like, so, okay, what's next? So we've convened at least 3 sessions in LA, made them open to the public, but definitely invited, you know, frontline organizations, environmental organizations, so that we all learn together how to access these dollars from the Department of Energy, Homeland Security, Department of Housing. So many departments have now integrated environmental justice into their grant-making platform. It's mind-boggling. It is overwhelming. So you kind of have to stick in, like if you're a housing organization, how does housing relate to environmental justice? And then write a grant for that. But maybe check out your local philanthropic organizations also, and not just Climate Reality Project, to see if they're mobilizing resources to apply for these technical assistance dollars to bring them to your local communities. I would definitely recommend that.
That's great. Dan, I know you want to come in on this. I also just want to throw one other question at you, which is, Marta's from LA, and there's lots of local support for these efforts. I'm curious how you engage in, say, a place like Alabama, where there are a lot of really concerning environmental justice issues, but there may not be the local network of philanthropy, of activists. Well, there are activists, but philanthropy to really do those kinds of things that Marta's talking about. So what you were going to say, and then also that question.
Sure. Well, I just wanted to say that the Sierra Club Foundation also has impact investments. So we have what's called a catalytic capital fund. And to your point, we think about our role in other foundations as coming in with the riskiest, earliest dollars of capital, kind of the bottom of the stack, particularly in underserved communities who don't have the quote unquote collateral to then be able to get and qualify for federal grants or state grants or that kind of thing. So coming in early with that catalytic capital and doing it in a way that provides that early capital that then attracts federal dollars, which then creates enough overall capital to bring in those larger institutional investors who are also going to get tax credits. So that's kind of the at the higher level where we're just, I'm on the board of Confluence Philanthropy, which is the network of about 250 investors and foundations. And it's a very live conversation about what the role is that foundations can play in that catalytic role that you're talking about, Marta. Yeah, and then repeat that question again.
I think, I was just going to say, I think in the South, though, we have a huge, beautiful, historical environmental justice movement. So there are environmental justice organizations there. I think if we want to replicate good models, we go to them first. We go to philanthropy there first. I do know things are changing in Alabama. Things are changing in the South, and there's better representation now than there was even 10 years ago. So we have to connect the dots between those that want change and have been demanding change and invest there first and foremost. And I know some of the best models that have been scaled up are actually in the South because of Bob Bullard and his growing movement in the South to make sure that they are not ignored.
Absolutely, and I didn't mean to say that there weren't environmental justice activists in the South. Certainly that's the origin of the movement. But my point was about the politics,
The local politics.
I've spent some time in Alabama, with environmental justice activists engaging with the state, and that's a really difficult interaction.
Totally.
And so my question, I guess, was how can organizations, philanthropists, organizations that might have a national sort of scope help support those efforts.
I think it comes back to communications, right? These are historic investments. No city, no town should pass up these historic investments that can repair and revitalize their communities. So you start there first and foremost, but you also want to put out a value statement. We're improving the health of these communities through these investments, and connect the dots for the leaders and connect the dots for the community. And it's really sometimes a failure of communication, a failure of visibility of what's possible, a failure of vision, so that we can make sure that those areas, because historically, those are really challenging areas to work in.
Yeah.
I totally agree, and I think I'm excited just in the last 3 or 4 years seeing investment of real foundation dollars into the Gulf. I think in part because, initially some of the foundations who cared just more broadly about climate change and emissions, there's a huge push for a bunch of new liquefied natural gas export facilities all throughout the Gulf to export natural gas to Europe. And as many of you know, the carbon emissions of natural gas is significant, in some ways even more significant than oil. So for foundations who for a while said, well, we just don't have the bandwidth to support all these local fights on petrochemicals or refineries or whatever, that larger frame helped kind of open the door for what's really needed in those communities is resources. A lot of those EJ groups are totally volunteer-led, community-led, mom with 4 kids who is trying to save her family from dying from cancer, and they're working day in and day out, but they're not registered 501c3s, so they can't even get grant money. So we've worked with other groups to provide some pooled funds. So one is there's an environmental justice litigation fund at Tides Foundation, and it doesn't pay for litigation. It actually pays groups general support dollars while they're in litigation, so they can last the 3, 5, 7 years in litigation. And then Earth Justice and Sierra Club and NRDC and others actually will engage in litigation. And one example of that is a Chinese company called Formosa was trying to get basically 2,500 acres of petrochemical plants in St. James Parish in southern Louisiana. And just last year, through litigation, but also the staying power of those local communities, we're able to get the Louisiana Supreme Court to vacate those air permits that were provided by the Louisiana Air Department. So it's an enormous victory, and those are the kind of things that I think are just provide a lot of hope for those other communities that you can take on, kind of the David and Goliath story.
Yeah.
But what we find is, at the end of the day, they even getting $500 or $1,000 a month to keep going is enormously helpful for these small community groups.
So that's excellent. I'm reluctant to say that we're going to go to questions because I've been enjoying asking questions so much. But we'll go to questions in about 5 minutes. But I want to ask maybe 2 more questions if we can squeeze them in. One is just, Marta, we haven't really even talked about your title, the Chief Heat Officer, which I think is incredibly interesting, incredibly important. It's relevant to everything we're talking about. I wondered if you could just talk a bit about what that entails, why it's important to have a Chief Heat Officer, and the sort of equity considerations that go into thinking about how to respond to heat.
Sure. So I'm one of about 10 Chief Heat Officers globally. They're in Australia, Africa, Europe. They're all over the world right now. And then there's two of us kind of on the western front, one in Arizona, David Handula, and myself in the West Coast, and then Jane Gilbert in Miami. What am I trying to say? Extreme heat for LA and all of these cities that are engaged is the primary climate hazard. That's where we have the most preventable deaths, the most emergency room visits, and again, these low-income pollution-burdened communities are the most impacted by extreme heat as their primary climate hazard. So it's of grave interest to the city of LA to get engaged in public health and prevent these preventable deaths and hospitalizations. It is a life and death situation. And some of the most vulnerable people in these vulnerable communities are pregnant women, people with chronic illness such as asthma, COPD, diabetes, heart disease, but really any illness makes you more vulnerable to extreme heat. We were talking about reproductive health in another session with Chelsea Clinton. They didn't even mention, I was very surprised that I think one of the main reasons Black and brown women, but especially Black women, have increased deaths during pregnancy or giving birth is because they live in these pollution-burdened communities, very poor diets, very poor access to health care, and there is not a good recognition of how to prevent those exposures or those deaths. So for me, it's really important as a chief heat officer to connect the dots to, again, systemically, historically, why are these people the most impacted? And we have to correct for all of those root causes of why they're where they're at in order to solve for the climate crisis, solve the pollution crisis, solve the health crisis. It can't be done in silos. It has to be done together. Right?
Okay.
Yeah, you want to come in, and I'll ask you one more final question, which is just, and you can also come in on this, but you know, in my time on the climate beat, I feel like the conversation around equity has risen, you know, to the, you know, we're talking about it here, it's a part of the conversation. I'm curious to hear your sense of how equity has risen in the climate conversation. Where are we now? How far do we need to go? And then especially, you know, in the Sierra Club, which is traditionally a you know, conservation organization. It's not necessarily, or doesn't have a reputation as being historically focused on equity. How has those conversations changed in the Sierra Club? So broadly, and then in the Sierra Club.
Sure. Well, just to add what Marta said about the heat effect, there is a provision in the Inflation Reduction Act for urban forests and planting more trees, and so that's the nexus for the Sierra Club working with folks like Marta is, you know, how do we in these communities make sure that we're getting more trees planted, more kind of close urban natural areas for the heat effect, but also to continue to address the human right to be able to access nature for everyone. So, so we're excited about that, and that's probably like that's one slice that we'll be focused on a little bit more and makes sense for our constituents and our chapters and that kind of thing. Yeah, so that's a great question. You know, Sierra Club's 132 years old, and it definitely acts like a 132-year-old sometimes, you know, including like a loss of memory. Or revisionist history. I don't know whatever it is.
History.
Yeah, right. So, and CBE, you know, has been a great, I think, partner for the Sierra Club in recent years. But, you know, 130
We were
years.
critics before, right?
What's that?
The environmental justice community were critics of the environmental movement historically.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
And I
exactly.
think what I would say is that the Sierra Club and other organizations have really stepped up to the plate to include those values and hire people of color that live in these communities, create them as frontline leaders for Sierra Club, not just the club chapters, but also the organization itself. So that has created a whole systems approach for the transformation of organizations like the Sierra Club. And it has been, again, I'm going to credit the environmental justice movement, Cesar Chavez and everybody else in the South who made this happen 30, 40 years ago, right? Because conflict can be really good. And that's an example of where conflict between environmental and environmental justice organizations has resulted in a transformative change for both of us and for the nation. Now we're in a really interesting scenario right now because we're post-pandemic. We're still suffering from all of the implications of the pandemic and trying to recover from that, especially these most vulnerable communities. But if you see the silver lining, we are in a moment where the federal government, at least California state government, environmental organizations like Sierra Club and EJ organizations are working together. And we're trying to change this together. Of course, we still have differences and conflicts, and that will always be the case because that's democracy. But we are in this moment where we can really make it happen but we have to stay abreast and informed. And hopefully my email is available. Please call me, email me, so I can help you figure out how to do this in your local town, city, neighborhood, because I really think it's important for all of us to take part in that solution and take part of this moment. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I want to get some audience questions. I'll go to just the two here and then there, and let's do two at a time because we have limited time, and I want to try to get to all of them. So yes, to you, and then we'll also go up here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kimberly Dowdell. I'm an architect with HOK and also the 2024 president of the American Institute of Architects. And
Great.
I have our CEO here with me.
Awesome.
And our two strategic priorities within the community of architects, AA specifically, are climate action and equity. So this was like the perfect session for us.
Great. Welcome.
And then also, I'm speaking on Building for Health tomorrow at 11:40, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, but East Lawn. But the question is, what specifically do you think architects can do and people leading the built environment? What recommendations do you have for us as we kind of think about what we can bring back to our membership? And then just also framing, if you go to architecture2030.org, it'll show you like right on the homepage that the built environment accounts for 40% of CO2 emissions annually around the globe, which is a pretty significant portion. So how can we break down some of these silos so the conversations we're having can tie into the conversations you're having so we can have a collective impact?
I have an answer for that, yeah.
Can we do? That's a great question, and I want to take two questions at a time, so then hopefully we can wrap more in. I was going to go to Shanda.
Good morning. This is excellent. My name is Shanda Demarest. I'm with Healthcare Without Harm, and we have the HHS Health Sector Climate Pledge that several hundred hospitals have signed on to recently. One of the pillars of that is for these health systems to be building climate resilience plans with the needs of the community in mind. We're trying to take it a step further and encourage them to build climate resilience plans with communities simultaneously. So I'm wondering if you could speak to any recommendations based on experience or how health systems can be thinking about including community throughout the process.
Great.
Awesome. I'll answer your question first. Well, at the City of LA, we passed a new building decarbonization or electrification policy, which is great. But architects in the City of LA actually helped inform the planning department, our equitable building decarbonization report, and I'm sure they spoke to many other council members as well, right? So that's one way that they got engaged in the conversation. Now we're going to existing building decarbonization. So I think architects can really embrace this concept of passive cooling, materials that provide natural cooling, how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions with low-income, older housing in mind, to make it more equitable, financially sustainable, and if you can engage in that kind of conversation with, for example, my office and advise us on that, or the Department of Building and Safety and advise us on that, you're providing a solution to government that we really need to hear so that we don't make mistakes that we've made before and just say, hey, all old buildings need to be decarbonized, and then people are displaced. The rent goes up, and it's not a solution because people are then unhoused. So we really need to think about the unintended consequences of our policies, and you guys can help us do that by your expertise and experience.
Two quick thoughts. One is Danell Baird, who is on my board. He's with Block Power. He's been funded by Bezos Earth Fund to do a countrywide analysis of existing buildings in underserved communities around power assessment, and to your point as well. And Block Power is a for-profit, so it's BLOCPOWER. So he would be great, and he's looking for partners around
that's
that.
great.
Yeah,
that's great.
And then the second thing, I'll have to remember his name, but I met an architect who's African descent from France, and he just got a bunch of awards a few years ago. There were a bunch of school buildings, I can't remember the African country, that were, the concrete block. What's that? Yeah, that may have been it. And he just took indigenous knowledge and created these buildings that were built with clay, They had openings at the bottom where you could put a vessel of water. So as you know, cool air came in, the water cooled that air and came through. And it was just a whole, you know, just using architecture, to your point, to create these passive solutions and not always focus on things that need power from the grid to do. So
Exactly. And with regards to resilience or Health and Human Services, in Los Angeles, we're using the UCLA heat risk map that tells us, you know, where historically the excess ER visits are, excess deaths are during heat waves. But we're having trouble collecting data from hospitals and clinics and keeping that data current. And I know Health and Human Services, Arsenio Mataka, was trying to help us with that. So, but it's critical data so that we know, you know, where we're going and we know where we've been so that we can improve these historically disinvested areas. So I think for me, resilience would be to include, like I said in my 2 minutes yesterday, this climate, equity, and health data, but especially the health disparity data, and specific to ethnicity, specific to zip code. And then in the case of the city, we want city council information so our elected officials can take action. But I think it's important to talk to the cities that you're trying to create resilience for, because they're also creating resilience plans and climate adaptation plans and collecting data and trying to transform the way that they do things. So it should probably be a great, and we're in the middle of a climate vulnerability assessment, collecting very key granular data for the city of Los Angeles to create a better resilience plan for the entire city of LA. So it would really help us to work with you. So I invite you to work with me and other cities as well. Yeah.
Okay, well, we can go for one question in the front, very quick, if you can ask the question very quickly.
Hi, I'm Arn Menconia. I want to ask the question about the problem. We're not seeing legislation on a federal level that is ratcheting down fossil fuels out of existence as the IPCC report calls for. I'm in the state of Colorado as a former county commissioner. We're not seeing a Democratic governor, House, Senate put forward legislation that fixes the problem, our addiction to oil. There will be a CEO from Chevron here. What kind of work could be done in the very close future, now that we're hitting 1.5 degrees this week globally, in order to advocate and fight for legislation that ratchets fossil fuel out of existence over the next 15 years?
Just before you start, big question, but you have, 30 seconds, so just, answer.
Well, there is an election coming up in 2024, and I'm not supposed to say anything about that, but I do know that a number of organizations are asking very direct questions as they're considering endorsements and putting out scorecards and that kind of thing. So, at the end of the day, until we fundamentally get at the fact that oil and gas companies have bought and paid for many of those legislators, we're not going to change the result. So I would say that for sure. And then the second piece for us is really on the financial side. Banks are customer-facing organizations. They've signed net zero alliance pieces and continue to ratchet up the pressure that they'll get sued for greenwashing if they continue to finance fossil fuels. And fossil fuel companies are on the run as far as financing. They have to go to private equity, which are a lot more expensive. So I think the part of it too is continue to elevate the cost for them for doing business as well. But yeah, I'd love to talk to you over the break about it some more. Sure.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we're out of time. I know, I'm sorry there, but I appreciate the engagement and an excellent conversation. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you.